Well, good morning and welcome to the last day of the Minnesota GIS-LAS conference. Hope you're having a great week. I'm Kate Carlson and I will be moderating this session, Web Mapping 2. Our first presenter is Nicole Helgeson and she works for WSB. The title of her talk is OpenLayers 101, Develop a Web Application.
Perfect. Thanks, Kate. Excellent. Yeah, I'm Nicole Helgeson. I'm a GIS developer at WSB, and I hope that you can walk away from this presentation just with a better understanding of OpenLayers and how you can get started building an open source mapping app. So our tasks for today just include a brief introduction to OpenLayers, just pointing out a couple parts of the site I've found to be particularly helpful when you're trying to get started, including the API and other examples. We're also going to take a look at some options on how to get your app set up, and also some steps on how to complete that. And then we're going to jump into some OpenLayers code. We're going to build a map from scratch, building different pieces of functionality along the way. And then after that, just have a couple of resources I'd like to share with you, including a link to this presentation and also the code that we go through. So a little bit about OpenLayers. OpenLayers is an open source JavaScript library, and it's used for displaying map data in web browsers. What I really like about OpenLayers is that although it has a bit of a learning curve, once you become familiar with it, it offers quite a large number of features that you can choose from. The code is pretty flexible. It's also mature. It has a large following. The code has been around for a long time as well. And I've also found that OpenLayers is pretty good for more complex GIS applications. A lot of these open source libraries have pros and cons to them, but I found that OpenLayers does have this going for it. It's good at integrating with other GIS applications. It's also considered to be a full-fledged application with fewer dependencies. So I'm just going to open the website, and I would just like to point out a couple of parts of it that I have found particularly helpful when getting started. The main page of OpenLayers, there's a section here called Quick Start. And this will offer quite a few more details than this presentation on how you can get started, how you can build your app. And so I'd recommend taking a look at this if you're interested in that. The top right part, there's an examples tab, and OpenLayers has a ton of different examples that you can choose from, ranging from pretty basic to pretty advanced. So I found this quite helpful to kind of gather information and examples when I'm trying to create the application. And then finally is the API. This I would say is most important, which is the documentation to how you can build out the OpenLayers app. You can search for the documentation here. Okay, so we're going to take a look at getting set up with OpenLayers. One thing that I initially found confusing about OpenLayers was all of the different ways that you can start to create a map. There are different ways that you can get started. So I've just broken it down into two different directions that you can go in to get started. Both of them have their pros and cons, and it just kind of depends on your needs. The first way is to use a CDN which is called the Content Delivery Network. And basically it delivers all of the OpenLayer libraries right to you. You don't need to download anything. You just simply insert the CDN into your HTML, and you can get started using the different libraries. And so that's also a con of this direction, is that you get all of the libraries. So it's not recommended for production if you're going to be using this in a live app. However, it is good for playing with the OpenLayer API, getting to know your different options. And I'd like to point out the second option. And this is the recommended option for from OpenLayers, and that is that you set up your own little dev environment. It does require a bit of installation beforehand, but once you have that set up and you import the OpenLayers modules, you just import what you need, basically. And this is the direction that we are going to go in today, for a couple of different reasons. Just mostly, I think it's good to show, how this would be set up. Also, the OpenLayers examples that are on their webpage use this format. So we're going to get started with that. So I'm just going to rearrange my screen just a little bit here. So we're going to give you a preview of how to get this set up. So the first thing that you need to do is to download Node.js. And Node.js is an open source server environment. And it's pretty easy to download. So you would just download that. And then you would also need Git. And Git is a version control tool for managing and developing code. And of course, your favorite code editor. On the left here, I have my favorite code editor. And yep, there's tons of different options. This one's VS Code. I mean, there's Sublime, there's Atom, lots of different options, just whatever serves your needs. And so before we get started, I'm just going to pull up a terminal. Oops, let's pull up again there. There we go. So right now, I'm on my the OpenLayers folder. And so the first step that you would need to do is to create a folder where your project is eventually going to live. And I've done this all ahead of time, but my folder name is OL demo. So I have created that. The next step would be to CD or change directory into that folder. So that's what I'm going to do. Make this a little bit bigger. There we go. All right, so I've CD'd. I have my folder where my project is going to live. The next step would be to install OpenLayers. And if you have Node installed, I'm just going to check that I have Node installed with node -- version. So it gives me back the version, so I know that Node.js is installed, working. And so if you have that set up, then you would just run this command, the npx create OL app, which I've already done, but you would run that command in order to install the OpenLayers library. And then the last step would be to start your local server. And I want to point out that when you install OpenLayers, inside the folder that you created, it will create a couple of different files that we'll go over in just a minute. So I'm going to start the local server, npm start. There we go. Gives you, it says that it's been successful, dev server running. So you have your local URL that you can develop off of. There we go, got our map. So I'm just going to split. If you're not familiar with Vivaldi, this is the browser that I'm using. It's pretty handy, especially when you have like over 50 tabs open. All right, so I've started my local server. OpenLayers gives you a boilerplate map to start off of, kind of get you started. And if I look at in the files that it's downloaded, I'd just like to point out a couple of things. It comes with an index.html file, which is where the map, where it lives. Got your CSS for styling. And then lastly, you have your JavaScript file, which is where we're going to be doing most of our work right now. And so we've got our boilerplate. Just want to point out a couple of things regarding the code here. So this is creating a map object. And if I just run to the documentation, show you some handy ways to look up your different options when you're creating your map. So I'll type in map. And what I like about OpenLayers, I feel like it has some pretty decent documentation and description of your different options. So we've created our map object. The target, we can find out a little bit more here in our options. We've got our target here. And so it says that it's the container for the map, where the map is living. It's an HTML element. And so in my case, it's pointing to the map ID, which if I go to my index file, you can see that it's pointing right here. So it's just it's basically telling OpenLayers where to put the map. And got a couple of other options. We've got layers defined. And in this case, the type of layer is just a tile layer, an OpenStreetMap tile layer, which you can see here. I also set the view for it. So you can customize this map object. Right now, it's pointing to this center point on the Twin Cities. And then I also set the zoom level here too. So that is the boilerplate. Let's add some data to it. Oh, one other thing I'd like to point out is with setting up your own dev environment, you get to import the modules that you need. And so at the top here, I've imported what I need for this demo. And so that will be located at the top there. So for our next step, I'm just going to comment this out. We'll move down to adding some data to our map. So we're going to add some GeoJSON. The source is from Geospatial Commons, and I'm a biker. I'm interested in where the trails are in the Twin Cities. So decided that I'd like to add this to the map. So we've got a new chunk of code here called Minnesota Trails. It's a new layer. When you declare a new layer, you need to tell it where to go and get the data. And in this case, I've downloaded the GeoJSON to a folder. And so the URL or where it knows to look for the data is in a folder here. And then lastly, you can add the layer to the map inside this layer array right here. So we'll save that. And we can see that the layer or the GeoJSON has been added to the map. However, I'm not really happy with how that looks. It's kind of hard to see. So our next step will be to style this. So let's comment this out. More space. Move on to part 3, which is styling the GeoJSON. So we've got the same code we had before. We have our Minnesota Trails layer. We have our map with our trails layer added. And then we have a new chunk of code, which is to set the style on this vector layer. And so you can see in the documentation, there's a lot of different options for setting style, lots of different examples. So let's see, I'm setting a new style. I'm setting the stroke for the line property. So if I go to the style options, look at the stroke, I can also click on this and dive deeper into the other options that I have. And I've set a color for this GeoJSON, and then also for set the width of that line. But I have other options to set if I want to. All right, so we'll save, and that looks much better. All right, and the last thing that I'd like to do is I'll add a little bit more functionality to this map. What I'd like to happen is when I click on a line, I'd like a pop-up to appear with a little bit of information about this particular feature. So comment that out, and we'll move on to adding a pop-up. See if I can get that all in there. Okay. That's smaller. Okay. So some new code in here. There's a couple of other things that I need to check out first before going into the JavaScript. And I'd like to check out the HTML file. So a pop-up needs to render somewhere, and it needs to have a container to be displayed in. And so I create a div to put that pop-up information inside. And then I also want to style that pop-up a little bit differently. So I have some code here that kind of changes the look and feel of the pop-up, makes it look a little bit nicer, makes the text appear how I want it to. So I can add that information here. Save that. All right, so we'll take a look at what changes have happened to this last part. So we have our trails, where the data is coming from. We have style set on the trails. Down in the middle here, we still have our map that has our Minnesota Trails layer added. And some new content that I've added is a way for OpenLayers to know where that div is. Where is that pop-up content going to live? So I've defined that in a variable.
Hi, Nicole. Also, it's 5-minute warning.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I've also defined a variable for the overlay, which basically displays the pop-up on top of the map. And then you need to add this also to the map, add the overlay. And in the documentation, you can find a little more information on this property. And then finally, we need to tell the map what to do when you click on a feature. And so in this case, I want to check when I've clicked on a feature, when I click on it, pass in some event information. And then I want to check if I've actually or return the information about that particular point that I've clicked on. And if I've actually clicked on a feature, it will display that pop-up information. And it will also display the property that I've set within that pop-up. And in this case, I've pulled the name from that GeoJSON. And then if I haven't clicked on an actual feature, then the pop-up will not display. So I'll save that. Moment of truth here. So if I click on a trail, I get a pop-up with the name of the actual trail. All right, so that completes our tasks for this web map. We've added some data to it. We've styled our GeoJSON, and then we've also added a little bit of functionality to this. And that completes the presentation. This is a link to this presentation as well as the code that we went over. Also, feel free to reach out. This is my email. I have my LinkedIn, and then if you're on GitHub, that's my GitHub as well. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was a great presentation and demo. We do have one question in the Q&A, so if anyone else has questions, please put them in there for Nicole. And several applauses. One question from an anonymous attendee is OpenLayers the new leaflet?
So OpenLayers the new leaflet? You know, that's a good question. I've used leaflet in the past, and I guess in my experience, I would not say that it's the new leaflet because they're quite different. Leaflet and OpenLayers are good for different things. Leaflet is quite good for mobile apps. It's very easy to get started. And in OpenLayers case, it is more it's a much more robust mapping applications for much more, I guess, complex GIS applications, and has quite a bit more features. And so it's kind of hard to say if OpenLayers is taking over Leaflet. I think both have their pros and cons.
Yeah, that's great to know. Do you find yourself working mostly in OpenLayers or Leaflet on occasion too, or are you focusing most of your energy into this application?
So I think currently I've been more focused with OpenLayers. A project that I've been working on integrates OpenLayers into our application. In the past, I used Leaflet quite a bit to build simple web mapping applications, and it was perfect for just kind of getting up and started building something simple. I kind of avoided OpenLayers because I felt that it was a steep learning curve.
Pete has a question. What about OL versus, or OpenLayers versus ArcGIS API for JavaScript?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see, the last time I used the JavaScript API or ArcGIS API was about a year ago. And that was also to build a more simpler app. I feel like the ArcGIS API has come a long way in terms of being able to integrate with more open source sources. And so I guess it just depends on your needs and what's easiest for you. Personally, I don't have a preference. It just kind of depends on what your needs are.
Just want to share out your demo code. That's really nice to have. Does anyone else have any questions for Nicole? I think this would make a really great workshop. For GIS-LAS, you should definitely consider that for the spring.
Yeah, yep, definitely.
Another question from Pete. Favorite extensions or plugins in VS Code for working with OpenLayers or other web mapping?
Favorite plugins? Oh, that's a good one. Trying to think. I know when I worked with Leaflet, I used a plugin for clustering that was pretty fun. And that was, I can't remember the name of the plugin, but it was in order to cluster Esri feature layers. So you could pull in the Esri REST feature service, and then you would be able to cluster those layers together. And that was pretty fun.
Right, a lot of people interested in a workshop, so check that out in the chat. If anyone else has any questions, we have a couple minutes left. Otherwise, we'll get going with Pete Wiringa's presentation in a couple minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello and welcome if you just joined the Web Mapping 2 session. My name is Kate Carlson and I'm moderating this section, and Pete Wiringa will be giving a presentation with the title Two Mixed Bags Web Mapping Projects and Their Developers. Think of any good questions, you can put them in the Q&A as he's presenting, and we'll have plenty of time for him to answer those questions afterward. So you can take it away, Pete.
Thanks, Kate. Hope everybody can see my screen. So yeah, thanks for coming. Let me get the web mapping projects as one of the mixed bags out of the way right now. When we talk about that, and we're not going to talk about that much today, that is the sort of, well, 90, 95, 98% of our web mapping projects that I would say we do in the group I work for, U-Spatial at the U. We do them in ArcGIS Online. We use a web map or a template, and this is going to be more about that other 2% or 5% of projects and the people who work on them and how we facilitate and support everybody coming together and doing great work. Oops, there we go. So a little background is important here because we need to consider the context of U-Spatial and how it's changed over the years. Right now, U-Spatial is located on the Twin Cities and Duluth campuses. When I started back in 2015, there were 1.5 FTE and a bunch of graduate and undergraduate research assistants. In 2019, we merged with the Geospatial Analysis Center at Duluth, and we've always had a heavy reliance on students. We still have 7 current and former students working with us, and some of the names of folks who are in our group, former and past, who've contributed to this: Adam, Mary Lee, Pete, Steve, and Zach. So this is, whether it's contributions in code or feedback or why are we doing it this way, this is really a group effort. And all of this started actually, the basis for this talk, with a geodesign project back in 2015. I was the 3rd graduate research assistant to start on this project when I entered the MGIS program at the U. And it was a web app for farmers and other stakeholders to figure out what can I plant and where to minimize or mitigate environmental impacts. And I came into this project, I knew we needed to rework the code. There were a long list of enhancements to make, and I wound up tweaking it some and doing some refactoring, but ultimately it came down to, I got to rewrite this thing. And I had to ask myself at that point, thinking in terms of the short term, the near term, what can I do quickly and efficiently to get this out the door, versus the long term? What is the responsible approach in development, given the context of U-Spatial? Again, our employees, we had a really itinerant group of graduate students and undergraduate students. You could come in for maybe 2 semesters and, maybe you've never written a web app or page before, and now you're a web developer, right? Make this app work. And I was a little bit different in that I was in IT and web development prior to coming to U-Spatial. So had to ask, is it responsible of me to write this in a way using these more modern tools and approaches that if somebody else comes in who has not worked in web development before, they're going to have this big learning curve, all of these hurdles to get through before they can maybe even make the web page appear in a browser. And ultimately, the long-term consideration in my head won out. I'm not sure I asked my boss if I should take this approach, but I went with an old school way. It's something many of us may be familiar with already. And I went ahead and I rewrote the application, and hey, it worked. End of the day, all good. And I looked at the code and what came out of that process of rewriting it. And, we got the enhancements in, but the code structure was about the same. It had the same nuisances and pitfalls and everything else. But substantially, it was an index file, an HTML file, a JavaScript file, a CSS file, and a bunch of images, which I think, and I hope maybe this matches with the rest of you in the audience, is sort of, it's where web was 15, 20 years ago. It's not really where it is today for some of these bigger and more involved projects. And I skipped ahead a little bit here, the old ways. Again, think if you were doing web work in the 90s, maybe you had one index file with some styles. Actually, I don't think styles were around, but you had one file or maybe 3 files. And when you work on these larger projects and you wind up with more involved applications and potentially thousands of lines of code, you start to lose things, especially if it's in one file. The best naming conventions and approaches for modular development, it kind of breaks down with one file. And I found myself getting lost in my my own code if I've got 3,000 lines in a JavaScript file. These are monoliths and opaque boxes, as the third bullet point says. You have these very big files, and it's hard to see sometimes what's going on within them. So what happened? Well, in 2018, I graduated and wound up getting hired on as a regular staff member in U-Spatial. And at that time and ever since, including the merger with the Geospatial Analysis Center, we've seen an increasing staff count, and we've also had an increasing demand for custom web GIS projects, custom web work, where those templates in, say, ArcGIS Online are not going to meet our needs. And one of the first things we needed to do, and we were working on this, I think back in 2016 or so, get everybody into source code management. We were much more itinerant. Again, a lot of couple of semester, maybe 2-year graduate students, undergraduate students. So that was a big challenge, but we had to do that. And ultimately, we wanted to get consistency across projects and within projects. Back then, single developer projects were the norm. Each of us would go off and we'd write our own code, and we'd manage it however we best saw fit. So long as it worked at the end of the day, great. And that's gone away. We're working more collaboratively with other developers now. We need version control to do that effectively. And how do we tackle challenges like white space differences? For those of you who use version control regularly, maybe you find nothing more annoying than finding differences in how your editor is set up versus somebody else's, and white space is different. So now your entire file has changed when really you went in to change 2 lines of code. These are problems that have been solved or challenges that have been met in the past, and we can leverage tools that are already out there to make our lives easier. So ultimately in 2020, just a little over a year ago, we put together a template, and let's go through that now. And I don't want to go through this whole slide. This is in the talk abstract, but big objectives, hefty goals or lofty goals. How do we do all of these things? And we support development for people who may be new to web development, and we get good, consistent code and products out of them in a way that enables better collaboration, and it's easy for us to keep it up and keep moving it forward. And that's a lot to ask for. So some of the questions we needed to address: what web mapping library are we going to select to do all of this? What front-end web framework? My previous life as a web developer, not a designer. If I don't need to design something, I don't want to. Give me a template. Give me a style that works. So a web framework is great for that, because you can really get into the weeds on making things look good when maybe things can look good enough with a template such as Bootstrap. What tools? What are the tools we're going to use to help bring all of this together beyond the framework and the web mapping library? How do we bring it all together? And then again, how do we keep it going? Excuse me. So I'm going to gloss over some of this in the short answers slide. Web mapping library. So we looked at ArcGIS API for JavaScript, Leaflet, and OpenLayers. And ultimately, I'm going to say we selected, but maybe it's I pushed for OpenLayers. We selected that back in 2020. Leaflet, as the previous speaker I think alluded to a bit, you can do some things, and it's great for putting a simple web map together, but you maybe hit a wall at some point, and OpenLayers has a lot of flexibility. And for some technical reasons, we dropped the API, ArcGIS API for JavaScript, from consideration. It's modernized. We're looking at that again now, more on that later perhaps. We did select Bootstrap. We selected I pushed for either way. Bootstrap selected as the front-end framework. There was some existing familiarity with that. We'd had multiple projects across several people in U-Spatial over time that were already using Bootstrap, and it's pretty common. It works. And finally, we have a GitHub Enterprise at the University of Minnesota. So we are using that for all of our source code management and issue tracking. So I talked a little earlier about old school ways of doing things, maybe 3 files and some images. Well, so what's the new way or the newish way? And some of these ways aren't that new. And we're going to go through some of these in the next set of slides. SAS, a different approach to cascading style sheets. 2006, JavaScript dependency management. I think NPM, which the previous speaker talked about, I think that appeared in about 2010. We have module bundlers such as Webpack and Parcel and so on. We have code hinters, we have linters, get the cruft out of your code, and we have code formatters. So none of these are really new, and they've come a long way in their lifetime. So, you know, we think about the challenges that I mentioned in the earlier slides, and we can meet those challenges, or those challenges have been met with a lot of what's going on already. So let's start with Sass. If you have not looked at Sass and you are writing a lot of CSS, I strongly suggest you take a look at it. It's a nicer way to write your styles, basically. It compiles to CSS, so you can still read your CSS in the end. And your Sass style sheets, you can write them as CSS, but they support variables and nesting and more. You can do a lot with configuration through this. And if you're using a front-end framework like Bootstrap, excuse me, if you're using a front-end framework like Bootstrap, those come with Sass options, and you can override variables and change colors and have that be consistently applied throughout the Bootstrap templates. And a very quick example, maybe I should at the bottom first, the old school CSS. We've got a legend and a heading level 4 within that legend class. That's how we write it in the old way, and that works. But if you think about bigger components and how things structure, well, you need to, as a developer looking at that code, understand the structure from those 2 lines of code. There's no nesting there, but if we look at the earlier example, we see the H4 specification nested within the legend. So at least for me, immediately that's clear that there's that relationship there. And it's been a convenient way to write things out. Oops. We selected Webpack as our module bundler. Module bundlers, well, they bundle things, for lack of a better word. What ultimately they do is they will produce from all of your code and your assets a package that you can deploy to a web server and spin up and run. And depending on how you configure that, it might be a single HTML file, CSS file, JavaScript file, maybe everything's merged into one. There are a lot of options here. It can be pretty involved with Webpack to set up. It is not always a straightforward or easy system to configure. We don't have to make, thankfully, too many changes to our configuration. And you can also run a development server locally. So save your changes, it reloads pretty quickly, and see what's going on there. And as a quick example of Webpack, well, this is the Minnesota Lake browser, actually. For anybody who's seen that, there are a few more assets or image files that aren't listed here, but a lot of code, a lot of different JavaScript files, and it's really reduced to index, CSS, JavaScript, and some other files. So Yarn for dependency management. Going to make a reference again to the previous talk in this session. NPM was used. This is an alternative to NPM. So you can specify your JavaScript dependencies in a package.json file, and you can stick that in version control. You should stick that in version control. And you add your dependencies. You say, I need OpenLayers, I need Bootstrap, I need, and name your package and go from there. And you can also define commands in your package.json file to run a development server or build your bundle. And here's a quick example of one of those. We've got a name. We have a script section. So if I type on the command line yarn build, I'm going to build my bundle. If I type yarn start, this line here, I'm going to start my development server locally so I can see what's going on. And then you typically have sections for development dependencies. Node Sass, this is what's doing our Sass or SCSS compilation over to CSS. There are typically a lot more than that. This is abbreviated. And some dependencies, this is what we have in our web template, OpenLayers, Bootstrap, and Popper.js, which ties to Bootstrap. And this is not something you would often edit directly. You would use yarn or npm to say, add this dependency or upgrade this dependency. Another tool in our set of tools, Prettier for code formatting. I cannot do Prettier justice in this brief presentation. Check out their website. They describe themselves as an opinionated code formatter, and what isn't these days? Its standards come from opinions that are maybe codified, right? Maybe good opinions, hopefully good opinions. But Prettier is going to take some weight off your shoulders. It's going to format your code, be it JavaScript or any number of other languages. It's going to format it consistently. So if you're a single developer or if you're a development team and you're running everything through Prettier, at least the same version, same configuration, that code is always going to come out the same. And you don't have to think as much about white space, for instance. Let it do that lifting for you. You can focus on being a GIS developer rather than the nuances of what's the appropriate way to do this, and make sure I'm not going to run into a merge conflict with other developers that shouldn't be there. Again, these opinions they're from professionals, right? I mean, I'm not necessarily really a web developer. Let these other people make the decisions and trust that they're making good decisions. Because if what comes out of their work gives you something that you can read and it's consistent, is that good enough for your purposes? Again, focus on the map. Let's talk about linters. So what is a linter? Linters tell you about problems in your code. It could be a style issue. It could be an actual error in your code. It comes back to standards and style guides. And opinionated is a word that comes in here as well. But if you can trust those opinions, those recommendations, however you want to call them, run with it. And typically, if you've used GitHub, excuse me, repositories typically have a README markdown file. Those are pretty common. So we've got an example here. These slides are actually written in Markdown. Here's a quick example of Markdown. If you have not seen it before, we have a second level heading preceded with 2 hash symbols and a 4-item list, each with a single hyphen and a space at the beginning of the line. So we run Markdown lint, and this is actual output from when I was putting this talk together. It's nagging me, right? It's saying, well, you've got blank line problems, you've got trailing spaces, and so on. And these are not, I don't really have to think about it when I correct these issues, and the Prettier code formatter can actually correct many of them at this point, I believe. So again, real output starting with not JavaScript, not HTML, but Markdown. I know the problems and I can address those. And I don't have to think about where are they. I'm told where they are. Excuse me. So getting into our JavaScript side of things, or ECMAScript, we use ESLint for our JavaScript linting. A little repetition here, but it tells us what's not up to some standard or appropriate for the style guide you've selected or are using. You can run into conflicts with Prettier and other linters with Prettier as well. So you need to look for, there's a plugin to help you get them. So Prettier is not changing code that then ESLint says, no, this is not the right way to do it. So you got to work through that setup a little bit. On the documentation side, ESLint has plugins as well. There is a JS doc or JavaScript doc plugin for ESLint. And we can go beyond how are you writing your code and take it to, are you documenting your code? Because that's one thing a lot of projects suffer from is lack of documentation, poor documentation, or incomplete documentation. So looking at ESLint, specific to the JS doc side of things, so I threw in a function and I took out a couple of lines of JS doc. And so I have a function somewhere in a file, and apparently that function takes a parameter chart config, but I didn't document it. I'm told that I'm missing documentation, and that nagging gets me to act on that. Another problem there. Here, if you're looking at different ways to define your functions, well, maybe you're using an old school way of doing it. Do it this way instead. Here's some unused code. Take that approach. I'm sorry, get rid of that unused code.
Hey, Pete, 5-minute warning.
Perfect, thank you. Almost through the linters. Style lint for our SAS or SCSS linting. Example here directly from their GitHub repository. It's a linter for CSS and SAS, or the SCSS syntax of SAS. You know, you didn't define this properly. You didn't. It's a linter, right? Skip ahead a little for the sake of time. So how do we really bring all of this together? And Microsoft Visual Studio Code is what we're using. It is for our purposes internally, it's our recommended code editor, because Visual Studio Code has a good marketplace, a good ecosystem for extensions. And those extensions, plugins, whatever you want to call them, support some of these linters and other tools that we're talking about. They support or they integrate them in Visual Studio Code. So as I'm changing, if I'm typing out my code, I might see a warning come up. When I save my code, it using prettier formats it automatically. It runs ESLint, it runs StyleLint, it runs Markdown lint, and it tells me what's going on, and really gives me and others an idea of what we need to look at, what we need to tackle, and what we need to fix. And it's highly configurable as well. It's great for Python too. So if you have not tried Visual Studio Code, I strongly recommend checking that out. I mentioned earlier, we're using GitHub Enterprise. So all of this, we bring all of these linters and code formatters and configuration for VS Code and some sample HTML and whatnot together, and we put it into a GitHub template repository. We check a flag that says, yes, this is a template. So when we go into GitHub and want to start a new web mapping project with OpenLayers, we click use this template, and we get a clone of this repository, and we can kick off our work from there. How do we talk about this? How do we use this? And communication is key here. And I will readily admit that when I went into this, I put everything together and I did a terrible job documenting it. And there is a lot going on here. We're both trying to assist new developers who maybe have not worked in the web before with getting off the ground and getting something out the door quickly. But we also run into the problem of, well, there are a lot of moving parts here. And for a lot of us, we want to know what those moving parts are, right? And that comes down to, there's this, what is all this section in our documentation? We're describing it, but just as you've seen very briefly in some of these slides, what is prettier? What is StyleLint, ESLint, and so on? So describing that and keeping up that documentation so people who are going to use our template can understand it is critical. So I hope to have more to show you today. Again, this was a little over a year ago, or about a year ago, that we put the template together, the first iteration of it. But we've had a slower tempo for new projects, getting off the ground, partially pandemic, partially other things. We've spun up a couple of geodesign apps using the template, and we've integrated some of what we've learned with other projects. 90-second warning, Kate?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Integrated some elements with other existing projects as we revisit. And a couple of our developers, I think they're still looking at this, are looking at Esri, our GIS for JavaScript API version 4, and snapping that into the template to replace OpenLayers, because that, as of, I believe, last December, now supports ECMAScript modules. So we might go back, or maybe we'll mix it up. What do we do to maintain the template? When we start a new project, we look at the package versions in that package JSON file, and we update things. If we're working on an individual project and we find something beneficial we think will help with the template, we'll go back upstream and integrate that with the template. And we talk about this in a group. We put in a pull request in GitHub. Maybe there's an email. Ideally, there's some review or at least discussion about it, and we go from there. So next steps, continue to communicate. Other things we're looking at, pre-commit hooks. So all these linters, and they're nagging us, right? But they're not telling us, or they're not forcing us to fix things. There's a way to, with pre-commit hooks, to force you to make these changes before you can commit your code to a repository. We're going to select a front-end JavaScript framework, probably Angular or Vue, probably not React. And we're looking at alignment with GitHub's Super Linter project, which you might want to check out as well. for their opinions on how to do things. And that's it. And I'm happy to take whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Great presentation, Pete. As a U-Spatial staff myself, it's nice to see, I've heard about this template, but it's really great to see exactly what all is involved. So thanks so much for that. And there's some great questions in the Q&A. Mike Dolbo is asking, was Dojo and/or Dojo AMD the reason you avoided ArcGIS JS API at first?
Oh, yes, Mike, that is a great question. And absolutely. The reason we're coming back to it now is ECMAScript modules and those availability. I frankly was never a fan of the Dojo loader. I found it pretty onerous. And when you're working with ECMAScript modules in other contexts, and then you have to go Dojo loader, it just, maybe I was missing something, but it didn't jive for me. It didn't work. And yeah, OpenLayers really won out for that. Leaflet as well supports ECMAScript modules. Excuse me, ES modules at this time and at that time. So thank you.
Great. Mike has another question. He currently has a monopoly on questions if anyone else wants to put anything in the Q&A. Great questions, though, Mike. Thanks. He's also asking, can someone reasonably wade into this approach one part at a time? For example, try out Vue without using SCSS or NPM bundlers.
Ooh, that's a good and maybe tougher question. So I actually have not really gotten into Vue yet, so I'm going to leave that off to the side. I would say partially. The bundler question, though, is important because Webpack is one of the things we use to bring everything together, right? I'm sorry, I'm not answering that well. Let me take a step back. So you can separate out the bundler from the code formatters and the linters and whatnot. So you can take a multi-phased or multi-pronged approach to this. So you could set up VS Code and the configuration files for prettier ESLint, StyleLint, and whatnot in one hand, get that out of the way. So you take a step there, and maybe you're still working with sort of old school ways of doing things, an index file, a JS file, a CSS file, but now you have support from your linters and code formatter there. Then you could maybe work the module bundler in at that point. And then again, I'm not sure the best way to integrate Vue or Angular with all of this, but yeah, you can certainly take it in steps. And we've done some of that as we've made changes over time. You know, now that we have VS Code set up, if we need to make a change to how ESLint works or add the JS doc plugin, for instance, we can take that step one by one. And I hope that answered your question.
Yep, he said that's great. Thanks, Pete. Any other questions for Pete? We have a couple minutes before the next presenter. So thank you very much. That was great.
Actually, if we have 60 seconds, can I have 60 seconds?
Yes, actually, Allison Slats has a question for you.
Oh, great. I'm happy to take that then.
You mentioned you have people coming and going from projects. Can you talk about management of the team? Do you have defined onboarding, offboarding procedures?
Oh, that's another great question. I'm going to stop my share because we're not going to have time for both. Our onboarding and offboarding procedures at this point are closer to give them access to GitHub, put them in this Active Directory group, and suggest they read up on GitHub or OpenLayers or some of this. We've got the documentation of what's there and why it's there, but we don't really have a great onboarding, offboarding process yet. But as more people come and go, hopefully we can flesh that out with some feedback as far as what's working and what's not. So great question, thank you.
And we have one more. Nancy Reed is asking, what's a good way to learn how to use GitHub?
I would say the GitHub themselves has some great learning tools. I would refer you to those and urge you to try to do it on the command line if you can, because it matches well with how they try to teach you. But yeah, check out I think it's learning.github.com or something along those lines. So thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. And it looks like we're on the hour. So we are on for our third presenters, our third presentation. There's 3 presenters. So joining us are Blaine Hackett, Bill Mitchell, and Alorm Agabalosu. Sorry, I just did not pronounce that very well. Their title is Two Mixed Bags, Web Mapping Projects and Their Developers.
Well, good morning. And hope everyone can hear me here, and let me know if there's any problems with screen sharing. It seems to be up. Thanks for joining us. We got quite a few people here, so that's great. I'm Blaine Hackett, and I'm the portfolio manager at Mingeo. But particularly in these projects that we're going to share with you, I was a project manager. So I kind of got co-opted to go back to my project management days. And with me is Bill and Alorm. And just real quick, Bill and then Alorm, can you just introduce yourself and how you're involved in the project?
Sure. So I'm Bill Mitchell. I'm a GIS developer with Mingeo and have been working on primarily the back-end code for some of these projects, but also a little bit of the mapping front end.
Thanks, Bill. My name is Alorm. I'm a GIS technician with Mingeo, and I'm basically involved in preparing maps that convey messages about the data that we need to talk about or present to the users of these applications.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to just present these projects that we worked on, and then, of course, Bill and Alorm, who did most of the work on them, will go through the technical pieces for you. Using spatial technology to deliver actionable COVID-19 information. Actionable, of course, that can sound like a buzzword. What is that? But, it really is used to distinguish between information that can improve things and just more informational, like trivial information. I would go a step further and say what we're going to show you is information that could be used immediately once it's gotten. So the topics for today, like I said, there was 3 projects. And we're going to go through each one of them today. COVID for public safety answering points, the testing and vaccine finder sites, which many of you have probably seen and used, and then vaccine mapping for service gaps in focus communities. So that's what we'll be looking at today here. And we had when we put this presentation together, we looked over all of the projects and we said, there's really some technical themes that we'd like to communicate when we present. And those are building for change, building for reuse, and then building toward the cloud. And as Bill and Alorm discuss the technical pieces of it, I think you'll see how these themes do run through all of these projects. So the first one we'll talk about is the Code for Public Safety Answering Points, or PSAPs. Many of you are probably familiar over the last year, the projects that are directly related to COVID many times have short deadlines. In this one in particular, we got informed on a Tuesday afternoon and the project had to be done by the following Monday morning. So needless to say, we got on our horse and we started going. And there was a few things that were in particular that the reason it had to be done so quickly is because they needed to communicate this information and to the emergency field staff of possible infections. But it had to be communicated to just the PSAPs, and it had to be encrypted information, so as to keep any of that information out of public view. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bill to discuss the technical details of this project.
Thanks, Blaine. Yeah, so for this, we ended up having a number of REST APIs that we interacted with, as well as some other data sources. This was really entirely a Python project. So we used the Pandas data science library a little bit, as well as heavily using the requests library. And specifically, we were using Python 3. Python 3 is great for those of you using Python 2.7. I strongly encourage you to go up to Python 3. So we used REST APIs to grab addresses from the Department of Health, a second REST API to geocode against the NG911 enabled geocoder, used a third REST API to do the point in polygon with an internal data set on where these PSAP boundaries are. And then we had an Excel spreadsheet that had the recipients and which PSAP, their email address and which PSAPs they needed the data for. And this all was then sent via the Minnesota Exchange servers using a special encrypted email functionality that's built in there. We did build a class just for sort of holding our REST API objects so that they would all act in a standard way. And then we really did ourselves some favors by separating the configuration from the code. And in terms of building for the cloud, we didn't end up deploying this to a container, but we built the whole system so that it could be deployed into a container and then just run on a schedule. So all of that was nicely separated, and that's where it really pays to separate your configuration from your code. Back to you, Blaine.
Thanks, Bill. So, of course, this project had to do with geocoding addresses. So it was a period of from October to February. And over that period, we had over 156,000 addresses were processed. And this was an automatic process. And of course, you always had to worry about the formatting. So the addresses that weren't geocoded many times had some odd formatting. We weren't able to go outside Minnesota. We couldn't do landmarks. And then we can't do phone numbers, just so everybody realized that we can't geocode phone numbers. But we thought that was a pretty successful rate. And this was set up to go on a certain interval so that it would send these emails out. And then the other thing that I thought was pretty cool is it would clean up all the information at the end of the day. All right, so we're on to the next project. And this project, we're talking about it was one project, but it was really two projects. And we were initially tasked to rebuild the COVID test finder, which the Met Council built way back in April of 2020. They did a great job of standing that up quickly. But what happened is, by the time the fall rolled around, it was decided that it really should come back to the state and be hosted by the state. But of course, after it was being used for a while, they said, we want to do some upgrades. We want to add some things to it. So that was part of it. It started in about November, and then on December 1st, we were informed that we had to be done by the end of the month. So this is the continuing theme of, hey, here's a code project, get it done. Wasn't the most festive holiday season for the team, but we powered through, and there's deadlines, and we made our deadline. So that was great. There was some other interesting things about it, that we had to really create the database model. It was kind of a manual process because they had set it up so quickly. And so getting that into an automated process, not even daily, like every 5 minutes, updating this information was critical for it. the other thing I want to tell you about this is the reason it was 2 projects is we had a sneaking suspicion that the vaccines were coming. So we said, you know what, let's make sure we build this so that when the vaccine website needs to be put up, we can repurpose most of this and, you know, and really get a quick turnaround. And of course, you know, that was very prescient on our parts because, you know, come January, they said, hey, we want to put up a vaccine finder website. So it was an interesting project, and there was a lot of work to do. And actually, Bill, I want to turn over to you to kind of talk about this process in particular, because you were really fundamental in getting this working.
Sure thing. So with this, we actually have data coming from a couple different sources. So we have the healthcare providers who are sending in data on where testing is happening, or eventually where vaccination is happening. And as some of you may know, bringing in data from a website and just throwing it into your processing and for eventual display on a website makes the computer security folks a little bit twitchy. So we did implement some steps so that there is human review of the data that are coming in before it goes into our data processing. So the providers use a form. It then is approved by folks at the Department of Health. And then we pull in that data, geocode the address for it. We'll potentially update a record or create a new record as necessary, or remove one. And that then updates a feature class that's hosted in ArcGIS Online. And then we use a second feature class that is then what's displayed via the website. There was also a second way of folks getting data in. The state had some testing sites that it was organizing, and those were being handled through an online spreadsheet, which had a second type of API. And so again, those had a bit less review, but still had some review. That they had to click a button saying, yes, it's ready to put on the map. They would click that button, and again, it would grab that data, geocode, and put that onto the map. So I think that's that. Yeah, and so we were able to reuse some of our REST API code from the PSAPS project. We did have a somewhat different structuring to how the data were formatted, because the 2 tools that we were using for the surveys and for the spreadsheets used a NoSQL type of nested key value structure. We ended up just using the ArcGIS Online geocoding service for this, since there were relatively few locations to geocode. And again, we had a feature service that was read-write, which is available internally, and then used view layers that are read-only for public access. And that view layer is cached by the ArcGIS Online content distribution network. And some of the things that made this happen is that we rate limited our API requests so that we aren't, hitting either our data sources or the ArcGIS Online functionality too hard. Splitting everything up into smaller functions, again, keeping code and configuration separate. And we built things abstractly and used objects or lists so that we could change maybe what fields were available, since most of what the processing had to do was to just say, okay, there's a question on the survey and it's going to have these values, and we just need to put them into the database. So we used some objects and lists to make it so that we could just add another thing that says, yeah, and just pull this field and it maps to this in the database. And we wouldn't have to write code or make code changes when those happened. And for those of you who were at Pete Wiringa's talk earlier, we also have been using some linting for this, specifically Flake 8 and PyLint to do the linting and code review for this. Next slide, please, Blaine. So there's a lot going on here, but the key point is that you can see here that we have a number of different for loops. And this is what I was saying about keeping things abstract. And so we just have lists of these items or dictionaries of these fields where we need to process it in a similar way. So a number of our questions on the form had an other field, and then there was a text box somewhere else which is technically a separate field, and those needed to be associated. And so we could just list here all the things that have other fields and smush those together. So that helped us move quickly through all of this and make it easy when someone says, oh, let's add this new set of boxes that we want on our survey. Let's add this, and there needs to be another field. It made it really easy to put it all together. Again, that could just be a configuration change, not a code change. So thanks, Blaine. Back to you.
All right. Well, now we get to look at the websites, do a demo of the actual websites. So you can see here the testing website, and the interesting thing about it is that it had to be very accessible for folks who use keyboards and so early on we had thought about really making this more of a map-centric type of an application, but after we really looked into it, we stayed with the current format that it was before, and so that you could see very easily that you could go to the filters, and then down here, of course, we have the information cards, which has all information, which is very searchable. If you just had map centric, it would not be as searchable. And so the information as far as the testing locations go, that is a point layer. And as you'll see when we talk about the next project, we were able to reuse some of this information. But as you can see, it's pretty simple. We tried to make it as simple as possible. And these drop downs, as Bill was saying, if a new drop down was put into the database, it would automatically update the drop downs to this the interface. And one thing I didn't mention before is that since it was such a quick project, we had to, and we didn't have all the resources that we needed, we had to reach out to some other folks. And Minute Central had some great people to work on the actual forms that providers and pharmacies would use to enter their information, and then some front-end developers from the Department of Revenue. So they did a great job here. So this is the testing. And if I pop over to the vaccines, you can see it's very similar. And so that was, reusing the information and being able to quickly get the vaccine finder up and working. And this, we want to show this because I thought it was pretty interesting how many hits we had here. So more than 50 million hits. And then what is really interesting is the peak day here with 2.3 million hits. So you can see that there was a lot of folks that really needed this information, and this is the website that they came to. So pretty happy with how this turned out. Any parting words on that one, Bill?
No, I think that covers it pretty well, although there may be some changes coming in the next few weeks.
Right. Yeah. So
this is still very much an active project.
Right. Right. So we have 5 to 11 year old categories, and so it has been evolving the entire time. For a while in the summer there, it was kind of static, but and that the other thing too is that MDH had a lot of folks that came in and out from different agencies, and they had to have a team of people that they didn't know come together, and so they were doing a great job helping us get the requirements, and we had some great folks with the EPMO and Minute, with project management and business analyst, help us figure out the requirements for this. So very big team effort. I can't say enough about that.
5 minutes left, Blaine.
All right. So the next one, I'm just going to go through fairly quickly because I want Elorm to be able to show the website itself, specifically for focus communities. And you're going to see that there is a ton of information. And we use this SVI with the census data in order to show these focus communities. And really, it was about finding gaps or vaccine deserts, if you will. So the information we put together, and that's another one that's been updated as we've been going. Lately we've been adding schools, locations, and enrollment, school district boundaries. I'm going to actually get to the demo here quick, and then Elorm, you can just kind of talk about some of this information as you do the demo. So I'll turn it over to you, Elorm.
All right, thank you, Blaine. Blaine, you have to stop sharing.
Okay. Let's see here.
I just did it for you, Blaine.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so here is what we are presenting to the planning group over at MDH. And we took into consideration the various groups that are involved in the planning process, like Blaine mentioned. We had people from community outreach. We had people actually planning to mobilize community vaccination sites, or what they call pop-up sites. But when we started the project, this is how it looked like. As Bill and Blaine mentioned earlier on, the red markers you see are the locations, the vaccine locations that he built from his script, and that's what we are using in here. And what we do with that is we build a 30 minutes drive time polygons around all these sites to show areas that are not going to be covered by these vaccination sites that are up and running. We also do have, like Blaine said, the SVI layer, and this is just zoomed in to show how it's supposed to look like, or what it looks like. We have the SVI ranges showing in here. And so what we do is we also included vaccination rates that is enabled by time. So people are able to see how the vaccination rates changed over time. As I mentioned earlier on, we had a community vaccination efforts that was put into another web application. And it has a time slider enabled on it, so we can see where the sites are popping up with within a particular period. Over here, we also have the vaccination rates, showing in the polygons, and they also change with the time.
Hi, Lauren. It's 11:25. If you could wrap up in a minute.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
And so the long and short of it is we did everything in ArcGIS Online. We implemented security through groups because the users don't want the data to be available publicly. And so all these people who have to interact with the application are placed in groups with passwords so they can access the application. There is so much more to show, but within the limits of time, I will just end it here and toss it over to you, Blaine.
All right. Thank you, Alorm. So I guess now we have to end up here. I'm not sure there's any questions that we can answer here for y'all.
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation. And thank you to the three of you for getting that information out to the public as quickly as you did. Those are incredible resources and statistics of the people using it. Definitely needed. There's some great questions here. We have the first one from Mike Dolbo. Did you get any feedback from the PSAPs or first responders on situations where those addresses of positive infections help them make decisions?
Yeah, we really did not have that type of communication going on with MDH. They may have, but we didn't hear any feedback about that. But I do know that the PSAPs themselves, the people who run those, were very happy with the outcome of that. And there were very few glitches. There could have been a lot of glitches in such a short timeline. But they were happy with the results that came through.
Great. Stacy Stark is asking, did you see any significant patterns with vaccination rates and SVI rating or ranking, excuse me?
I guess we were not specifically involved in the use of the tool. And Lauren, I'm not sure you've been talking with those folks. Have you seen any patterns or any interesting things that came from that?
Yeah, there are occasions where I've seen places with very low SVIs also turning up with very low vaccination rates. And there are also places with very low SVIs where vaccination sites were mobilized, and that also increased the rate of vaccination over a period of time. So definitely how we present the data, how it's being used, and the outcomes are kind of being in line. But there are also some places where there are very high SVIs, there is a vaccination site, but there is no real change in vaccination rate.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Nancy Reed is asking, is there a way to make the focus community mapping vaccination information available to the public or more people?
Yes, so we do have the ability to do that. The request would have to go through Department of Health just to make sure that that's available. But you certainly can, if you have specific questions, Nancy, you can get a hold of me and we can discuss that.
Thanks. Mike Doble has one more. Were there any vaccination deserts found as a result of the analysis where people live, as in not in the national forest?
Go ahead, Alorm.
Yes, obviously there are deserts. And obviously, as Mike also asked in his last part of the question where there are forests, where there are national forests. On a bigger level, yes, it would seem like these are forests. There is nobody living here, but most of the census tracts that I interacted with had at least one person, living there. That is counted or accounted for by the ACS data that we put in there for information.
Yeah, we should do a shout out to Mike for providing us with all the education layers. So it was really helpful for us, Mike.
Yeah, and I think we should also specifically acknowledge Tanya Mayer at Met Council, who'd done a lot of work on the testing site location database before it came to us. And in fact, Blaine, did we have I think we had an acknowledgement slide.
We do. I just am sharing that right now. I didn't realize it wasn't sharing.
Thanks.
So yeah, so we had a big team of folks, and all these people were critical in making this a success. So I think we are at time now.
I think we are. Thank you so much for presenting your work, and I appreciate the questions here too. I hope you all have a great rest of your conference today.
All right. Thanks, everyone.